The afternoon light came flat off the buffalo grass and made everything look like it had been pressed under glass. She had been watching the man for the better part of 3 minutes before he saw her, long enough to notice the way he held his hat, crown down against his thigh, not fidgeting with it, just holding it there, like he had decided that was what hands were for when there was nothing else to do with them. He was looking at the train. She was looking at him. Pearl tugged the corner of her sleeve. That him? I expect so. He's tall. Don't stare. Pearl looked away, then immediately looked back. She was 9 years old and did not yet believe that the world would penalize her for curiosity. Behind them, Bess stood with one hand on the trunk handle and the other pressed flat against the station wall, feeling something in the boards that the rest of them couldn't. A vibration, a pulse, the train still bleeding heat into the platform. When he turned and saw them, he went still in the way that people go still when they are recalculating something quickly and trying not to show it. She watched his eyes move, from her, to Pearl, to Bess, back to her. She walked to him. I'm the woman who wrote to you, she said. This is my Aunt Bess, she doesn't hear. And this is Pearl, she's 9. She lost her family last February and she's been with me since. He looked at Pearl. Pearl looked back at him with the particular steadiness of a child who has learned that adults mostly don't mean harm. They just take a long time to think. He looked at the woman. You didn't say. No. A moment passed. The station master moved a crate somewhere behind them. A horse shifted on its hitch post. Can you work? He asked. Yes. All 3 of you? Yes. He picked up the trunk, that was all. The road out to the farm ran west through flat country, and the flat country ran to the horizon without offering anything by way of explanation. She had grown up in Indiana, where the land at least had the decency to roll a little, to suggest it was thinking about something. This land was not thinking. It had made up its mind. She watched it as they rode. She was cataloging. The soil was pale where the road cut through it, too pale, lighter than it should have been for early September. The grass on either side was short and tired. She noted 2 fence lines that had gone slack, the wire sagging between posts that leaned toward each other like men at the end of a long argument. A windmill turned on the far rise, but slowly, and one blade was bent at the tip, giving it a slight wobble she could see from the road. Pearl sat in the wagon bed between 2 sacks of oats and watched the country go by. Bess sat with her hands in her lap, and her face turned into the wind, reading it the way she read everything now. Through what her skin could tell her, since her ears had stopped 3 years ago after the scarlet fever worked through the household and took what it took. Nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then Pearl said, "Is that your creek?" She followed the girl's finger, a dry cut in the earth running roughly east-west about 100 yards south of the road. The banks were cracked and pale. A few cottonwoods stood along it, looking apologetic. Dry Sand Creek, the man said. He hadn't looked at it. He knew it was there without looking. It doesn't have any water in it, Pearl said. Not in September. When does it? Spring, March, April, sometimes into May. Pearl considered this. And then it stops? And then it stops. Pearl looked at the dry creek bed a while longer. And then she looked at the woman. And the woman looked back at her. And something passed between them that was not yet a plan, but was the beginning of one. The farmhouse was 3 rooms and a lean-to. She walked through it the way she walked through every new space, methodically, touching the edges of things, noting what worked and what didn't. The stove had a warp in the firebox door that she could fix with a wedge of iron. The window over the dry sink faced east, which was good. Morning light was better than afternoon for a kitchen. The root cellar door swelled in its frame and had to be lifted slightly to open, which she noted and did not mention. Bess went through the house differently. She pressed her palms to the walls. She crouched and put one hand flat on the kitchen floor and held it there. She stood at the back door and looked out at the field for a long time, not seeing exactly. She had explained to the woman once, after the fever, that she had learned to receive information through different channels. She did not mean it mystically. She meant it practically. What she couldn't hear, she felt. What she couldn't feel, she watched. The man had unhitched the wagon and was somewhere out by the barn. Pearl had found a toad under the back step and was crouched over it with enormous seriousness. She unpacked what needed unpacking and left the rest. That first evening she cooked what there was, which wasn't much, and they ate around a table with one lamp between them and the dark settling in at the windows. The man ate without looking up. Pearl watched him the way she watched all new things, openly, without apology. After supper, she washed up and Pearl dried, and at some point Pearl said quietly, "He seemed sad." She did not answer right away. She handed the girl another plate. "Some people are," she said finally. "It doesn't mean they stay that way." Pearl dried the plate very carefully, thinking about this. Did he have a wife before? I think so. What happened? I don't know. But you think something happened. She looked at the girl. I think something happened, she agreed, and left it there. She found the old irrigation channel on the fourth day, following the line of the dry creek bed south until it bent, and then following the bend until it straightened again into a shallow trench someone had started cutting toward the back field. The trench ran maybe 40 yards, and then stopped, the soil at its end piled in a low ridge, as though the person digging it had set down their shovel one afternoon and simply not come back. She stood there a while in the wind. The wheat fields stretched behind her, thin and pale at this stage of the year, the kind of thin that told you it had been getting by but not flourishing. She could see where the ground sloped very slightly, a few inches over 100 yards, the kind of slope you'd never notice walking it, but that water would notice, if water had somewhere to come from. The dry creek, the unfinished channel, the slope toward the field. She was not an engineer, but she had grown up with a father who believed that a woman who could not read a landscape was not finished with her education. He had shown her how water thinks, not poetically, practically. Water always takes the available path, he had said. Your job is to be the person who makes the path available. She went to find the man in the barn. Who started the channel? She asked. He looked up from the bridle he was mending. Previous owner. Why did he stop? A pause, broke his leg, then sold. Does the creek run full in spring? March through May some years. Could the channel reach the back field if it was finished? He set the bridle down. He looked at her the way a person looks at a question that is not as simple as it sounds. Maybe, he said. What would that do to the wheat? Another pause, longer this time. Change things, he said. She started the channel 3 weeks later, on a clear Tuesday morning when Pearl was inside with Bess doing sums on a piece of brown paper. She dug for 2 hours before she heard boots on the dry ground behind her. She did not stop digging. He stood at the edge of what she had done and looked at it. She had continued the old trench another 12 yards and had begun to angle it toward the slight depression she had found, the low point that led toward the field. You've got the angle wrong, he said. She stopped. She looked at the trench. She looked at the field. Show me, she said. He went back to the barn and came out with a longer spade and a piece of string. He tied the string to a stake at the channel's start and walked it out slowly, adjusting for something she couldn't see until she crouched and closed one eye and looked along the line and saw it. The ground was not as flat as it appeared. A secondary slope, subtle, that would deflect the water east before it reached the field. Oh, she said. You'd have lost half of it. Yes. She moved her trench 3 feet to the left and started again. He watched for a few minutes, and then he picked up his own spade and came to stand beside her. And after that, they dug together without talking, which was more efficient, and also something else, though neither of them named it yet. The neighbor came on a Wednesday in late October, a heavy-set man on a gray horse, moving with the confidence of someone who believed he had something important to say. She watched the shape of the conversation from the kitchen window, the neighbor talking, the man listening, the neighbor gesturing once toward the house. She had seen this kind of conversation before. She knew what it looked like. She went back to what she was doing. That evening, after Pearl and Bess were settled, she sat down at the kitchen table. He was already there, both hands flat on the wood, not reaching for anything. He came about the arrangement, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Does it change anything for you? He considered this with the seriousness she had come to recognize in him. He did not answer quickly, but when he answered, he meant it. No, he said. She nodded once. Then it doesn't need to change anything for me either. He looked at his hands, then at the window where the dark had settled against the glass. Then he said, her name was Margaret. She died in childbed 3 years ago May, the baby with her. She did not fill the silence. I'm sorry, she said when enough time had passed. Yes, he stood up. I am too. He went to bed. She sat at the table a little longer, listening to the wind press itself against the walls of the house, looking for a way in. Winter came hard and stayed. The creek froze solid enough by January that Pearl could walk on it, testing each step before she put her weight down. Bess stood on the bank and tracked the girl by sight and by the vibration of the ice through the frozen ground. She did not call out warnings. She couldn't. But once she stamped her foot twice on the bank, sharply, and Pearl looked over and stepped left without being told why, away from a thin patch she couldn't have seen from where she was. Pearl came back to shore and stood beside Bess and looked up at her. Bess tapped her own temple twice. Pearl nodded very seriously, as though this answered a question she had been carrying for some time. They finished the channel in February during a 4-day thaw that made the ground workable again. They took turns when one of them tired, which the other pretended not to notice. On a Sunday in late March, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the kitchen, after breakfast, while Pearl was outside and Bess was somewhere in the back of the house. He stood at the table and said he thought it was the right thing to do, for practical reasons and for other reasons he didn't have a good way of saying. She was at the window, watching the field. The wheat was showing the first real green she had seen in this ground since October. She turned around. He was watching her with the steady, serious look she had come to know. Not demanding, not afraid, just waiting, honestly, for what she would say. Are those other reasons true, she asked. He thought about it. Yes, he said. Then yes, she said. Something in his face shifted, not much, but she saw it. Something that had been held carefully for a long time loosened, just a little, at the edges. He pressed his lips together and looked at the floor, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just been told he can set it down. She looked out the window and let him have that moment without witness. The county clerk needs 2 witnesses, he said after a moment. Bess can witness if someone writes it out for her. And Pearl? She almost smiled at that. Pearl would like that very much. He made a sound she had not heard from him before, short, quiet, the beginning of a laugh that he didn't quite finish, but it was there, it existed. She filed it away. By June, the backfield wheat was standing a foot taller than the front fields. He walked it one evening in the long light, moving between the rows with his hands out at his sides, letting the grain brush his palms. Bess had found, somewhere in her silent reading of the soil, a patch in the southeast corner of the garden that the others had overlooked. She had pressed a handful of dried seeds into the woman's palm one morning without explanation. Squash seeds, from somewhere deep in her traveling bag. They were in the ground by nightfall. They were the best squash of the summer. Pearl counted everyone. She kept the tally in a small notebook with careful handwriting and reported the total to anyone who would listen. And when the man heard the number, he said it was more than he'd expected, and Pearl looked like she had been given a gift. The wheat came in the 2nd week of September. 4 days of threshing, Pearl managing the grain sacks and Bess keeping count in her own way, tallying with marks on a piece of board she carried in her apron pocket. The man drove the loaded wagon to town and came back with the receipt folded in his coat. And at supper that evening he set it on the table beside his plate and smoothed it once with his thumb. She read it when she passed to take the pot from the stove. The banknote was settled, not reduced, settled, and there was a remainder on the right side of the column. She put the pot back on the stove and stood there for a moment with her back to the room. Pearl's voice ran on about something she had seen near the creek, A heron or maybe a crane, she couldn't decide. It was a heron, the man said. They come through every September. Every year. Every year. Pearl considered this with great satisfaction. I'll look for it next year then. You'll find it, he said. She turned from the stove and brought the pot to the table and sat down. And the four of them had supper in the particular, ordinary quiet of people who have learned how to share a table. In the third week of October, she came in from the garden at dusk and found him in the lean-to, working by the last light with a small block plane and a length of white oak. She stopped in the doorway. He was making a chair. Not a chair to replace one. There were 4 chairs already. There had been 4 since the beginning. He was making a 5th. She did not say anything. He did not look up, but he knew she was there. His hands kept moving, the plane lifting thin curls of wood from the seat, the grain opening cleanly under the blade. She went inside and started supper. That was October 1882. Outside, the wheat field lay quiet and cut clean. The irrigation channel ran dark with the last of the season's water. The garden had gone dormant, its rows turned and resting, already holding everything it would give back in the spring. The lamp on the kitchen table burned steady, and the 5th chair sat waiting in the lean-to, smelling of fresh oak and new work, which is what the future smells like when someone has decided to build it.